Welcome, everybody. We're going to wait one more minute so some more people can join. Alrighty, we are getting close to 100 attendees, so we can get started. Thanks everyone for joining the Shared Streets community meeting. We really appreciate you taking the time. To get started, if you would like to listen to this webinar in Spanish, you can see the little interpretation button at the bottom of your screen, and you should be able to select Spanish. Everybody else needs to select English, or else you're going to hear the volume at a lower volume. So everyone can switch over there. Awesome, thanks, Sam. Okay, everybody should be in their respective interpretation rooms. Just a couple notes for housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you should see a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions throughout the presentation, and then at the very end of this webinar, we will have a whole 30 minutes for Q&A. So feel free to put all your questions in there, and we will happily answer them. If you have any comments, you can put them in the chat. Again, try to keep questions into the Q&A button, but the chat is open to ask questions directly to the host and panelists as well. And then, of course, please be kind and respectful of others and kindly share your thoughts and questions. This is a project we're really excited about, so we're excited to build it with you. And this webinar is being recorded in both English and Spanish, and the recordings will be available on the website after this meeting, and we'll send out a link with that information tomorrow, and we'll make an FAQ out of the great questions that you all ask. So for the agenda, first we're going to introduce everyone to the team, and then we'll do an overview of the temporary shared streets that you may or may not have experienced in COVID and the pandemic and since then. Then we'll do an overview of the Shared Streets program and what we are looking to build. And then we will talk about the survey that has officially opened as of this meeting, and then we'll do our Q&A session. So the project team, you can see the videos on the screen right now. So Jay Decker is our project manager from the city of Denver. He is in the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. Josh Malum is the Consort project manager. My name is Rachel Bowen. I'm the engagement lead, and we'll be doing polls throughout the webinar. Nora is also working on engagement with me. Charlie Alexander is the design lead, and he is with Farron Piers. And Meredith is with Livable Cities, and she is also on the design team. So say hi to everyone. You'll probably have some questions for them later, and we'll learn from them throughout the process. So for our first poll, I'm curious to know where you all live. So you should have a poll that is just launched to your screen, and you can answer what area you live in. Awesome. It looks like we are getting representation from across the city. We have a lot of people from Central Denver, a lot from East Denver, North Central, and some people that don't live in Denver. Thanks for joining us. Okay, I'm going to end this poll now. Great. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jay to talk about the temporary shared street.
Rachel, I'm sorry, this is Dean. Is there a chance you could show the results of that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
I'm sorry. Then I can, yeah.
Yep, there you go.
Thank you.
Yep, everyone should be able to see those now. All right, Jay, take it away.
Awesome. Well, nice to see that there's quite a few folks from Central Denver. That's where I live. So howdy neighbors. And just to introduce myself, my name is Jay Decker. I manage our Office of Innovation at the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. And my job, you know, it's kind of weird. I do a lot of kind of random stuff. Self-driving cars and drones, but also stuff related to how we rethink the right-of-way, how some of our thinking has evolved during the pandemic based on our experiences staying a little bit closer to home, you know, experiencing outdoor dining, shared streets, stuff like that in our roads, which, you know, formerly we thought of as vehicle-only spaces, but as Denver grows and expands and evolves, we're realizing that, you know, that's not necessarily needs to be the case anymore. So we're looking at multimodal benefits and a variety of other ways to use our streets, and shared streets is a big part of that. You know, as far as the temporary shared streets go, so I imagine, you know, the reason why many of you are on today is you either were able to bike or walk or, you know, live near or maybe even drive through one of these shared streets. And really thinking back a couple of years ago, we had the Colorado stay-at-home order initiated by Governor Polis. Because we live in the great state of Colorado, you really can't keep us Coloradans inside for very long, even if you tried. And so we were seeing that quite a lot of folks were gravitating towards our streets to recreate, to kind of move around, to maybe stay a little bit more locally, going to the grocery store, and then also, frankly, just, you know, really gravitating to some of our great parks. But because there were so many people outdoors and giving everyone, you know, that 6 foot of physical distancing space we originally started with prior to masks, you know, we were seeing people going into the streets, we're overcrowding our parks, things like that. And so that is where the city went ahead and launched our temporary shared streets program. We originally thought that this would last about 30 days and we'd all be back to normal. Clearly that didn't happen. You know, one of the reasons why shared streets stayed out for, you know, the better part of 2 years, as opposed to just that month, is because of you. You all really, you know, flocked to it, used it, loved it, and really talked to your city council members, and they were able to all officially sign off on keeping it longer. And then the mayor recommended that we keep it longer. And so that is why it ultimately stayed out there for a number of years. And so the first iteration of what you saw really was something we did in about a week's time, where we leveraged more construction type barricades. And so that's why you see this image here on the left. Big, bright, very visible, but also very ugly and very movable. And so this is what we would call a type 3. Traditionally, it would be used for, you know, if we were doing some sort of utility work on the street or the street was closed for, you know, major construction. And so that's what we could use in a temporary amount of time. And that is ultimately kind of what we rolled out across the city. But it's important to note that while that worked in kind of a temporary capacity, what we're talking about today is kind of learning from that lesson, but we would be using a variety of different treatment types and materials that would be much more sustainable, much more attractive as well. One thing that some of you may have noticed is that, you know, starting early 2021, we actually did start transitioning some of these shared streets. Some of them were located in areas that weren't getting as much love as others. So we went ahead and kind of figured out new places to put those. Other locations, we just wanted to actually improve upon the design. Like I said, we were using those temporary construction type barricades. And so we graduated to doing different kinds of signage, different kinds of design, and then using different types of materials. The ones you can see here are water-filled jersey barriers. So these are big, heavy, immovable kind of structures when filled with water. And so we were able to make mini traffic circles, neck downs, chicanes, a whole bunch of kind of technical words to say, use them in ways to slow down vehicles and then actually deter vehicles as well. So it was a safer environment for people walking and kind of playing or biking in those streets. And also so they were more sustainable than the original types of materials. And frankly, one of the best things that we did during the temporary shared streets is we collected a lot of data. A lot of times when we're talking about kind of a citywide approach for counting bikes, for example, we rotate different locations and may get a week or two of data. At many of these locations, we actually got months of data. So we're able to see a strong reduction in the number of vehicles that actually drove on that street prior to the pandemic. And then of the vehicles that still drove on that street, many of them are folks that lived on the streets or delivery drivers or what we would call local traffic. They were actually going marketed slower as well. And so really when you talk about getting more vehicles off of these streets and then the ones being on there going slower, it created a much safer environment that people felt comfortable where they could go ahead and walk and roll and play on these streets at frankly, a much higher rate than we saw prior to the pandemic. And so that kind of really showed when we created this environment, people really enjoyed it and gravitated towards it. And frankly, this data is one of the big reasons why we're moving forward with the creation of this formal program and having conversations with the community about where we'd like to see more permanent style shared streets in the future. Jumping off from kind of the temporary aspect, when we started this look into creation of a formal program, we wanted to go ahead and make sure we talked to the community and really get some of their feedback, even if it was delayed, about the temporary program. So for almost an entire month, we had a survey open this August where we had nearly 3,000 responses. We promoted it. Many of you may have seen it, and that's why you're here, through email, social media, yard signs, and many other avenues. And we really got some really great feedback on the folks that used the street, and then also from feedback from folks who didn't, and kind of what some of their thoughts and opinions were about the actual streets and kind of what direction they would like to see the city head towards in a more permanent program. As far as what the data showed, it really showed that, frankly, 9 out of every 10 respondents really liked the temporary shared streets. Only 7.4% did not like them. And then only 9% did not actually want any sort of permanent shared streets. So most people liked them, and most people wanted to see them continue in some form or fashion in the future. And then what's really important about this is that we had a really high response rate. So 3,000 is really great. It's a good representative sample of Denver, but even more so, I think it was a little bit over half of the people that actually responded actually lived on one of these streets or adjacent to it. So they got to experience it every single day. And it wasn't necessarily something across town they did once and they liked it. This is direct feedback from the folks that saw it and lived it every single day. And I think that really shows the power of having slower, safer streets in front of our houses and how people really enjoy that. So as far as what we're working on today, like I said, we really want to build on the success of what we learned during that temporary shared streets and turn those lessons into a permanent program, and then ultimately have that program create different types of shared streets across the city where the community sees value in them and would like to be a partner with the city to create them in their community. One important thing to talk about at Dottie is that through the last probably about 10 years or so, we've really gone through a bit of a renaissance on how we think about our streets. A couple decades ago, our streets really were just about moving cars and getting cars from A to B as fast as possible. But as our needs as a city and just frankly, the complexity of our streets have evolved as we've grown and changed, we've really started a paradigm shift where we put people walking, people biking and transit, and then any sort of ride share or freight above just a single person in a single car. There's many reasons for this. It's more efficient, it's better for the environment, but also frankly, it's much safer when we design this way. And it's a philosophy that we are continuing to scale up, and shared streets is a big part of that, making sure that we figure out which streets should actually be much safer for peds and bicyclists moving forward. And then as we move through this project, some of the goals that we've outlined in the Dottie Denver Moves Everyone Master Plan, which is ongoing right now, and what some of you may have participated in, is really these 5 goals. And the master plan is something we do just about every 10 years, and it looks 20 to 30 years into the future for us to understand what some of the future needs and future constraints are going to be in Denver, and then allows us to start working on them today, because as you know, it does take some time for the city to ultimately work with the community, figure out projects and implement them so it's done right. And so some of the key components that we work through on a lot of our projects are really what we're talking about similarly here for shared streets. So providing greater mobility options, making sure our streets are safe for everyone, making sure we provide options that are sustainable for our planet, especially as it warms, and also things that work well for our community. And then some of the more boring stuff, that is related to quality and maintenance and operation, and making sure that things that we build are properly maintained over the year. And then one huge aspect of this, and you can kind of see it as it floats throughout all of these goals, is equity. Really making sure that we put our equity hats on and we understand where the most need is in our communities across Denver, and then devote resources in those areas that maybe traditionally have lacked the attention. A big part of establishing this formal program is understanding, our temporary version the last couple of years, but we weren't actually the only city doing this in America. There were quite a few other trends that we noticed and have been working with other cities to kind of figure out lessons learned on their end. And then also, frankly, shared streets in some capacity actually did exist prior to the pandemic. So what could we learn from some of those shared streets that are already established and already formal? So it's really a twofold, looking back at kind of what's been done across the nation, and then also working with different cities during this time period where we all kind of figure out what temporary shared streets meant and how do we make them more permanent. And so one of a good example here is in San Francisco, they didn't call them shared streets, they called them slow streets, but were functionally the same thing. You can kind of see they had some signage. They didn't let through traffic on some of these cars, but as you can see, it is peds and bikes and folks on scooters and wheelchairs, kind of all mixing with vehicles. And they actually, probably because they're in Silicon Valley, were able to work with Google, who actually identified that these streets were slow streets and would actually reroute cars away from them during the pandemic, which was pretty cool. Another really great one to learn from is Bell Street in Seattle. So this is a really good example of what one block of more of a commercial style shared street could look like in Denver. So as you can see, it was kind of just a traditional street prior, but then they actually created this environment where they removed curbs. They created an environment that was really flush, and so you could be on the sidewalk or you could be in the road or kind of vice versa, and it was really seamless and easy for you. but it was created with materials and in a design where, yes, cars can still drive through and there still are parking spaces for them, but it's very, very, very hard, if not impossible, for a car to speed through here. And so cars are going slow, people are going slow, you can mix safely and kind of move about in a way. And this is a good example of how really good design can force slow interactions to make it safe for everyone. Another example that we looked at in North America is actually Argyle Street in Nova Scotia. So it's important to look at places that have similar or worse weather than us in the winter as well. Seattle can't claim that, but certainly Nova Scotia can. And you can see this is kind of a ground level look at something similar to what was done in Seattle, where it's an area where, as you can see, there's no curbs. It's an area where pedestrians and bicyclists are able to kind of filter out where needed, but there still is that area where cars can come through. But through intentional design, placement of planters, really restrictive travel lanes, and even things like brick pavers that cars can kind of feel, it gives vehicles kind of that environment where they know they have to slow down, and it makes it safer for everyone on that block. And then our neighbors to the northeast, Chicago, they actually have two shared streets. So the left one is an area where it's a good mix of downtown residential and commercial, not dissimilar to maybe like a Larimer Square that we have in Denver. And on the right is Argyle Street, which is a little bit less high density. As you can see, it's kind of a mix of smaller buildings with some medium-sized ones, but really the same type of design is pervasive through both. And so removal of curbs, having space be activated by people and not just cars, but still maintaining that space and potentially even parking spaces for cars to go through and use, but designed in a way where they're going very slow, so it is very safe for folks who are walking, rolling, playing, biking, what have you in the street to work really well with vehicles. So that gets me to the point of, what is a shared street in Denver? We just went through a couple examples of what we have seen in different cities, but Denver is a unique place and we want to put our own spin on it. And so some of the ways that we're thinking about shared streets is that they are kind of smaller segments. So it's not a full shared street network. Just because it would be very, very expensive and time consuming to do so, but strategically placing these for 1 to several blocks that connect to commercial or residential, but also to different sort of facilities, biking, walking, trails, otherwise, where we can connect it into the larger network where you can use it for transportation, but it also exists in a way that is a destination amongst itself. And then what we saw on some of the previous examples, all of those were really centered around commercial. So it really was kind of designed as a place to be, to hang out, to eat, to shop, to whatever. But what we learned through our temporary program is that a lot of folks just really enjoyed these in their communities for recreating, maybe using it as a way to access a bike lane a couple blocks away that gets you to a park or what have you. And so we wanted to make sure that we also were looking at establishing shared streets in residential neighborhoods that didn't have any affiliation with commercial buildings at all. And so what we're proposing here in Denver is that we actually have 2 different types of shared streets. So we'll have that commercial type, you can see those downtown, Cherry Creek, other areas with high clustering of commercial, if it makes sense. And then also places that are strictly residential or maybe adjacent to a park, which we're going to call community, which are places where you can hang out and stay, but they connect more so into a larger network for you to travel through to get to different accessible places in Denver, either walking or biking.
Awesome, thanks, Jay. Now I'm going to launch another poll. You can see it popping up on your screen. This one has 2 questions. So as we just learned, we're going in the direction of having commercial and community or residential shared streets. We want to hear about different ways that you would like to experience them. Yeah, pick your top one. I obviously would love to pick all of them, but pick your top one. Yep, and also a reminder, I see a bunch of questions coming in the Q&A. That is perfect. That's exactly where we want to see them. We'll answer some of them just via typing, but we'll answer most of them in a live Q&A at the end. Awesome. We still have some answers ticking in, but as far as commercial areas, it looks like number 1, people would like to grab a meal or drink with friends and family. And then the runner-ups are attending community events and traveling through. And then for shared streets and residential areas, people would like to use them to travel through primarily. And then secondarily, gathering with friends or neighbors.
Rachel, can you publish it so folks can see?
Yep, there's still a couple of responses coming in, so I don't want to.
Great.
Okay, looks like they slowed down. Okay, I'm ending the poll now. And you should be able to see the results. Awesome. All right, back to you, Jay.
Wonderful. Well, really great to see a diversity of options there, but maybe a few are popping up here. So, you may be asking yourself, we did this for 2 years. Why take the time to build a program? And it's a very good question, frankly. And the chief reason is, during the pandemic, we had emergency orders to just go out and do it. And so we really didn't actually speak with the community at all. We were trying to work really quickly to address a need. And then, through the course of 2 years, we made adjustments based on talking to the community, but the actual locations themselves, how they're designed, how they're maintained, we didn't get a chance to talk with you all, and we want to do that. And that's our opportunity to do it right now. Also, we want to be really thoughtful about locations for the future shared streets. We had a data-driven analysis that looked at, areas that we thought would be have a really big need for some of these temporary shared streets, and then also looking at some of our kind of equity locations as well. But we have a lot more data now, and we have the ability to actually provide you with some of the options to get your feedback for prioritization and maybe which ones we do first, maybe which ones are on the back burner. So again, really wanted to make sure that we identify a whole host of locations and then also get you the ability to provide input on them. And then also, I talked about this in the beginning, but we really want to sit down and thoughtfully think about how we design these. If you experienced them a couple years ago or just saw them for the first time in a few photos, very temporary, looks like construction, not something we want on our streets or in our public right of way for the long term. And so we want to be thoughtful about what these look like, how they operate. Do they match, the corresponding community that they're going to go into? Is it something that's sustainable and that, the signs just don't leave for a few days because someone decided to take them? And then also, we have to do a lot of internal programming and to figure out, where does this sit? What kind of funding can we get year over year to actually design and construct these? What's our long-term roadmap here? And so at the city, we typically work on what we call a 6-year kind of construction plan. So we look 6 years in advance, figure out how much funding we need each year to design these, to build them, to get multiple ones going at the same time, and really have that long-term plan where folks can look at it, know they participated, your input is seen, and then we actually do have that kind of to-do list, so to speak, on the first ones that we want to accomplish in the next 6 years. And so through some of that program development, we've been talking with community members, community stakeholders, working internally, experts, peer cities, a lot of the things that I talked about to develop this vision and ultimately come to you with it. And so really where we've landed is that we want to create a shared street program that prioritizes people through the creation of these comfortable spaces where y'all will be able to move, interact, and play within our right-of-way. And right-of-way is just a technical term that is basically the street and the sidewalk, the thing between the two buildings. And you can kind of see here on the left and the right. But then also, it's really important that we do successfully implement, maintain, and sustain these as well. Like I said, with that temporary program, it was easy to do quickly and it worked well, but it wasn't sustainable. It didn't look good. People kept moving the barriers. Some safety issues arose over time. And so this is our opportunity to do it right.
Great job, Jay. And now I get to talk about the fun part. Actually, Jay probably talked about most of the fun parts already, but I wanted to talk more about kind of the project process. So this is on this slide, you see the major elements of the project, and on subsequent slides, we'll talk about each one of these in a little more detail. First, we'll talk about community engagement. And I think hopefully most of you were able to take the first survey that Jay talked about and shared the results of earlier, which really focused on what people like about those temporary shared streets and how people want to see more permanent shared streets and really get them to become a permanent program. Now the team is in the second phase, the citywide program engagement. So really we're thinking about sharing what the project is about. Educating people on what shared streets are and what they aren't. Some people think because if there's not a curb like on Fillmore Street in Cherry Creek, that's considered a shared street. That's not always a shared street, but that could be a version of that. And then we also want to get your input on some of the preliminary design elements. And we're doing that through the polling process we're doing along with this community meeting. And then it's also what the survey, the second survey we've deployed today is about as well. And then in early 2023, we'll really come back to the public and really provide kind of a share the results of the phase one. We'll also talk about the different elements of the program. We'll show you some design guidelines. So what the elements will look like when a shared street is designed and implemented in Denver. So we'll come back to you in early January. So keep a lookout for that next 2023 touch point. So community engagement. So along with kind of an executive leadership team, we also have worked hard to really pull together a stakeholder working group that includes the following folks: so RNOs, BIDs, government officials, Denver Public Schools, and then a bunch of community organizations and leaders. So we really did a good job of reaching out to all different types of folks and getting them involved. So we're getting a well-rounded or balanced input kind of 3 or 4 times along the process. And then we really looked at some of the early on in the project on some of those temporary shared streets. We looked at a lot of the operational and geometric variation on those streets and kind of looked at an analysis to identify what may help us identify kind of candidate streets or locational analysis. So this map is really meant to show you, we're starting to dig into that now and identify those actual candidates for streets that could become shared streets. And the blue are kind of those community streets that what Jay was talking about, and the yellow are kind of those ideas for commercial shared streets. And there's a lot of different criteria. Some are labeled here and some are not. But the idea is to kind of get to this phase and then go through a prioritization process that will kind of distribute these equally across the city and allow folks to really have those implemented in their neighborhood. So I think that's something we're working on right now. And as part of the prioritization process, we'll ask you all to provide streets that could be good candidates for shared streets in the next phase of the project.
So a significant part of this effort is to develop design guidelines that the city can follow for constructing different shared streets in Denver. Josh described the process for identifying streets that might be candidates. So with a candidate shared street in mind, this set of guidelines would help us inform how specifically to design a shared street, how to make it operate in a way that's comfortable for everyone to share that space together, and then how to include amenities in a shared street to sort of meet some of the activation goals and some of the purposes that community members noted or note as important for using the shared street. Earlier, Jay described how context will play into this, identifying streets and treatments that are more community or residential in nature versus those that are maybe a little bit more commercial in their nearby land uses. We think that that will affect the types of treatments that could go in a shared street to make it most useful for the people adjacent to it. We're certainly thinking through how to design the streets to be accessible for all people, independent of how they move. So making sure that they're accessible for people in wheelchairs, for people that have vision impairment. We want to make sure through the guidelines that shared streets have very clear gateways at their entrances so that all people moving, but especially people driving, have an understanding that they're entering a space that they should expect to be shared, and that when they get onto that street, they will see people walking in the street, and that they need to be yielding to them as they move through the space. Lastly, a tenet of shared street design is to minimize the signs and the pavement markings to really encourage the shared nature of that street. So we're helping identify, what that minimum amount of signing and markings looks like in Denver. Some of the major categories that we want the guidelines to address. Foremost, we want to make sure that the guidelines steer the city and community members to identifying measures to control the speed of vehicles and the volume of vehicles on a street so that it's comfortable for sharing. There's a variety of treatments listed here, many of which have been implemented through other city projects in different scales of permanency. Including things that horizontally narrow or alter the alignment of a street, like curb extensions or chicanes or neighborhood traffic circles, things that affect people's ability to turn onto or off of a street to reduce street volumes, like major street refuge islands, and then things like speed cushions, also known as speed humps, that physically are very uncomfortable to go over at a high rate of speed that can encourage lower vehicle speeds on a street. So these are the sorts of things in the design guidelines that we're exploring to manage vehicle speed and volume. That's not really the exciting part of a shared street. I think the exciting part is what are all of the different amenities that we possibly put on it to make it a better space for community members to enjoy on a regular basis. Some of those might be related to the needs of people walking or biking along the street or through the street, things like parking for bikes or micromobility e-scooters, things like bike repair stations. And then on the next slide, Rachel, a variety of other treatments that we're exploring to make the street a more pleasant place to be from a placemaking and urban design perspective. Trees and vegetation, different materials that can increase sort of the urban design quality and create a character for the street. So some images here of surface treatments on the pavement that are somewhat artistic, that are definitely signifying the place as unique and different. Different forms of street furnishings, things like benches or light fixtures or tables and chairs, community art that could either be on the or a part of these other urban design features, or someplace different altogether within the right of way, and different treatments aiming to improve the sustainability and the resiliency of the street, We would often call these green street treatments that might aim to decrease urban heat island effects or improve drainage by capturing stormwater runoff and letting it infiltrate the groundwater supply locally rather than diverting it to a storm sewer, as well as a variety of different recreational amenities that we're thinking about. Social spaces for people to gather, different play or fitness elements for people who want to recreate in some capacity on the street, as well as things like community gardens, acknowledging that maybe people would enjoy using the space to grow flowers, vegetables, fruits for their homes. So the list that we've shown here certainly isn't exhaustive of all the things that could go into a shared street, but they're the ones that we're thinking about thus far, and looking forward to getting feedback from the group here and through our outreach process on additional ways that people want to use these spaces so that we can address those topics appropriately in the design guidelines.
Awesome. Thank you, Charlie. I have one more Zoom poll for all of you, which I will launch now. This is asking questions again about what will make you want to linger in a shared street, and then what elements will make you feel safer in a shared street. So feel free to answer those now. And just so you know, I will send the link to the survey in just a second in the chat, but we ask similar questions through the survey that we will be distributing citywide. And there is an other, like, fill in your own ideas option on that survey. All right, looking at the results so far, as far as things that will make people want to linger in a shared street, it looks like trees, vegetation, and shade is by far the front runner. Seating elements is also high. And then as far as what will make people feel safer in a shared street, elements to reduce the number of cars is the number one, and then elements to reduce the speed of cars is the runner up there. Okay, we'll let a few more answers trickle in. I see, Jeff, your question in the chat. That's a great question about how it should be select all that apply. In the more formal, like, Survey Monkey survey, you can choose your top 3. This will help us prioritize what to actually implement when it comes time. Because I agree, they're all great. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. And you should see the results on your screen. All right, Josh, back to you.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, just to finish up on a couple of the elements of the actual project. So program development kind of encompasses all of the things that we've been talking about so far as part of this project process. One of the things we did early on is establish this brand for Shared Streets. So this is now kind of the official Shared Streets brand, and it goes along with some of the other transportation elements that Denver has been deploying. So that's something that we're proud of, and I think it really kind of shows how we want to prioritize the people walking, biking, and rolling on these streets. And then program fact sheet. So when people have questions about shared streets, there's a place to go and figure it out. And then also that program fact sheet will kind of walk you through the process of a life cycle of a shared street. So from inception all the way to implementation. Also, in order to kind of implement some shared streets on a more permanent basis, there are some existing policies and municipal codes and procedures that need to be updated. And it's also in the process, and part of this project is to update those. So legally we can implement shared streets across Denver. So there is some really some code stuff that we really need to figure out and work through before we start implementing these on a permanent basis. And also we're talking to the city about, how many people are going to be managing this program and working on this program every year. So the design process and implementation process can actually get taken care of. So that's kind of the overall program development pieces. And then lastly, Jay briefly talked about this, but an implementation plan. So as we work through this locational analysis, there's a lot of residential streets that could qualify for a shared streets, but we want to kind of identify that roadmap on which ones make the most sense, and then narrow it down to figure out which ones may go first. And then next is program funding. So this is a new program, and we need to identify funding sources, whether it be capital improvement dollars from the city, or are we looking for grant funding and other mechanisms to fund implementation of shared streets? Because some of these images that you see here are pretty high-end, high-expensive projects, infrastructure projects. So how do we fund all of this? And then also figuring out a maintenance plan for shared streets. These are a little bit different than a typical street, and we can't always drive a big plow down these streets and clear the snow, or a broom truck either. So one of those things is figuring out how maintenance will happen on these, and then an evaluation plan. So once a shared street's implemented, we want to figure out, is it successful? And if it's has some lessons learned, we want to apply those lessons learned to the next design process of the next shared street, so we don't continue to make mistakes that may not make these as successful as they could be. And then project schedule. So just talking through the schedule a little bit, the red star on the graph below is where we are. We're at that first community meeting, and you can see we've been starting the locational analysis, some of those design guidelines that Charlie has talked about, and really getting into the program development. So as we work through the process, we'll go back to the stakeholder working group and show them progress. And then also after the new year, we'll come back to you and show the progress we've made as well on kind of those 4 major elements of the project. And then once we do that, we hear your input, we'll go back to the stakeholders and tell them what we heard, and then start to finalize the actual program. That being said, I think as this program is developed, we will the city will continue to refine it and make it better moving through time. So look for us to come back to you in a bit. An implementation process. So this is kind of the idea would be to kind of the life cycle of a shared street, right? So we identify the shared street funding is secured. We use the long-term roadmap that we've established and prioritize which projects go first, whether it be a community street or residential or commercial street. And then once that's done, we want to confirm the location and type with a community. So with every project, there'll be a community process as well. So this isn't the only time to provide input for shared streets. Every time one of these is designed and constructed, there'll be a complementary community process. And once we identify that location and type, we'll go either through the commercial design guidelines or the community design guidelines. And a lot of this will be determined by kind of land use and context. And I think hopefully that's been portrayed well through this process. So like Jay was saying, if you think about some old streetcar streets or main streets throughout Denver and the neighborhoods, those are some of the commercial streets, and then residential streets are spread throughout. And then once that happens, we go through a design and construction process.
All right, I've alluded to this a couple of times, but we have this design preferences survey that I have put the link to in the chat. This has similar questions that we asked during this webinar, but feel free to take it again. We would love to collect your feedback via that method, and then also share with your friends and family and neighbors and everybody in Denver. So you can look for that. And then now we will answer your questions. It looks like we have 65 questions so far, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. And then anything that either we're hearing a repeated question, or if we don't get to it, we'll try to put it in the FAQ that will be on the website later. So Nora, I'll hand it to you to facilitate.
We do have a lot of questions, and we'll try and get to as many as we possibly can. And if your question doesn't get answered, know that it will, as Rachel indicated, ultimately be answered one way or another in an FAQ. I'm going to start with David at the top. He posed the first question, which was reiterated several times by other people who are attending. Why was the city unable to elicit community feedback and improve the shared streets in real time, like Seattle, rather than remove them altogether? And then there were a number of follow-up questions related to why not leave them in place, improve them as is, and iterate the program as you are now. I don't know if Jay, you would like to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. And truly an excellent question, right? We had something out there, it was working well. Why do we have to start over? To address the thoughts around Seattle, we worked with them quite a bit during the period where we had ours up and they had theirs. They actually had done prior planning work around a whole network of what they would call like neighborhood bikeways. So really aggressive traffic calming to help improve bikes. We didn't have that backbone. And so we selected streets for the most part that didn't actually have anything planned on them. We hadn't had conversations with the community. Whereas Seattle, they had already had conversations with the community and confirmation that they wanted these things. And so they were able to do them in a temporary fashion and then work to formalize them over time. We did that in Denver in 3 separate locations, 30th, Bayard, and Byron, where we had overlap with our bike network for neighborhood bikeways, which was the exact same thing as what they did in Seattle. And so we did keep 3 around. They reverted back to neighborhood bikeways because we wanted to have more conversations about adding additional elements to pedestrianize the street. But we did do kind of a similar approach to what Seattle did. We just didn't have as many of those locations prior identified to the pandemic like Seattle did.
Thanks, Jay. I'm going to go to Nicole's question next, which got a lot of upvotes in the box. And Nicole indicates, we really need a full network of shared streets. Neighborhood bikeways with car diverters every 2 to 3 blocks. Drivers have nearly all streets for unencumbered driving. They don't need every street for through access. So this question of fitting these into a network is Nicole's question, with a number of other folks who asked that very same question. There's a lot of interest in that. Jay,
Yeah,
that might be your question too.
Yeah, I would say another great question. It's great to see the number of folks on here that are really well educated about the history of our cities, of what streets can become, and then are advocating for them to be more so than just for vehicles. And the city is right there with you, like we talked about. We're implementing a variety of different treatments across the city, which depending on what makes the most sense. And so some areas are getting Vision Zero traffic safety improvements. Many corridors are having speed reduction go in right now that passed our city council this year. We're building out an additional 125 miles of new bikeways over the course of the next few years. And then we have a bunch of transit corridors and BRT going in. And so shared streets, while kind of a relatively new thing that Dottie is considering, certainly we'll be able to scale up. I don't know if we'll be able to have a full network of shared streets across the city in the next few years, because that's a massive undertaking. But certainly if these are things that people really enjoy, they work well. I definitely think over the next several decades, as we be really thoughtful where these are located, how they're designed, how they're maintained, we very well could build a larger network, and certainly one that fits in well with the different bikeways and trails, BRT, all of the other demands on our transportation network.
Thanks, Jay. Tom asks, will there be any streets fully closed off to cars? Allowing cars on these streets seems like it defeats the purpose of safe and communal space.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And so not to get too technical, but a shared street means that whoever's in it, be a car, a person on a wheelchair, a person on a bike, a jogger, they're all sharing it safely and equitably. What you're referring to is what we would call a closed street. So maybe it was a street, you could think similar to Bannock Street in front of the city and county building, if you've seen that, where we've just completely closed it from cars. And so bikes and pedestrians and anyone else can enjoy it. But no cars. And our parks department has done that in a variety of parks as well. But it's really different for when we're talking about shared streets. And primarily the reasons are, if we do it in a neighborhood, many of our neighborhoods and streets, that's the only way to access them, is to go down that street if you live there. Certainly we have things such as deliveries, we have trash, recycling, compost collection, fire access, things like that that make it really complicated. So in some specific instances, I think there are locations in the city where we could close streets, but what we're talking about here are making them much safer for everyone and still allowing vehicles that should be there, which would be people that live there, deliveries, emergency vehicles, stuff like that.
Jay, you might have answered Ian's question just now. He asked a rather technical one, which is, why are modal filters to physically prevent through traffic not in the design guidelines? Drivers will never respect signs that ask for local traffic only, based on his experience with temporary shared streets.
Yeah, so what you're referring to is what we call vehicle diversion. And so you can actually see that in a lot of the new bikeways that the city has installed. Bayard would be a really good one, and there's a few others, and certainly a lot more coming to the city, where we physically block off part or full access to the street and still provide a way for bikes to get in, or certainly people on the sidewalk and things like that. And it greatly reduces the amount of traffic on the street, while still allowing some of the other side streets to float with traffic. And so when you're talking about a shared street, we don't want to fully divert traffic, because then that would get into like a closed street environment. But I do think there could be some instances at select shared streets where maybe we do diversion at one entrance and some of the other entrances are still open, similar to what we've done for neighborhood bikeways across Denver, and which we'll start to see more. But really the reason is shared streets are meant to still have some level of vehicles on them, so we can't just fully close them off.
Great. We actually have a question from Wendy about the length of shared streets that was shared. Why are we aiming for just 1 to 3 blocks?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. In a perfect world, we would have a high quality shared street network that ran all the way around Denver into surrounding communities and things like that. It's difficult though. These shared streets are very different than what our current streets are designed as. And so it does take time, effort, and most importantly, money to actually reconfigure these to be properly safe for everyone to be in the street, and not necessarily just putting up a sign and hoping people actually take them seriously. So they need to be designed and have the right materials that physically slow cars down that do remain on that street. And like I said, that just takes a lot of time and money. I think we can certainly build on locations and make them get bigger over time. But instead of choosing one really big project that's going to take a really long time, we wanted to make sure that we could put these in as many locations around Denver as soon as possible, and then work on growing them to be longer, if successful.
Thanks, Shay. We actually have 3 questions in a row about location. Are you considering north-south shared streets? We sorely lack safe and comfortable north-south routes through town. That's from Rachel.
Yeah, really good question, Rachel. And yeah, as someone who has a hard time finding safe north-south routes when I bike, I totally agree with you. To answer your question, we're looking at every single street in Denver, running it through an analysis to figure out which ones make the most sense, and then we're going to come back to the group to actually prioritize which ones we should be doing first. And so yes, we're including every single north-south street in Denver initially, and then you and your community will have the opportunity to prioritize maybe a really special north-south street we should work on first, if everyone agrees.
Catherine asks about the VAMOS network that's been reviewed, and whether it has been reviewed for input into the routes and streets being considered for shared streets. A lot of community input went into that network, and a number of people are interested in the answer as to whether it's being factored in.
Yeah, so we're familiar with Avi's work and the Vamos network with what he's done. I think it's really important, and really applaud him and his group that actually show people kind of safe and accessible streets to bike on as they currently exist, and not necessarily waiting for the city to improve on a certain aspect, which is great. And so we have been working with him. I hope we can actually use that as input. That said, we have to kind of go through our own process, because that wasn't a city-led community outreach process, but I think we'll arrive at some similar conclusions. But just note that network, from what I understand, is a little bit different. So it's primarily for bikes, where this would also, shared streets also include pedestrians. And so there's just different metrics associated with it. And so it won't necessarily be a perfect overlap, but I do think there absolutely is going to be some overlap with what they've created there.
Similarly, we've touched on this in a number of different ways. Leslie asks, how is this program overlapping with the existing bicycle network that's being built out? They're kind of shared, they're slower speed, but shared streets would be infinitely preferable. Mm-hmm. Is there a way for these kinds of streets to become less of a one-off and more of the standard for pedestrians and cyclists, with cyclist-friendly treatment first? So that interaction with the bike network.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of how we'll prioritize these is how well they work with existing and soon to be constructed bikeways that are really nice and high quality. So it does work as a network, right? So let's say there's a shared street for 3 blocks. You're not going to get very far in 3 blocks, probably not to where you're trying to go. So you want them to be connected to a protected bike lane, which is then connected to a trail, which is then connected to your destination. And so we're working as a city to make sure all of that stuff connects, and of course connects with transit and a variety of other things as well, local amenities and grocery stores and parks and all of that. And so we can't put the perfect solution on every street right away, but we want to make sure that the various solutions that we're coming up with, pedestrian, Vision Zero, transit, bike, shared streets, they do connect and allow you to have more options to get where you need to in a safe fashion.
Sean asks a question about elements on the shared streets. Is Denver allowing speed bumps, speed humps, speed lumps, or whatever they might be called on shared streets? These would make car users respect and slow down for other users.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I love a good speed bump or speed hump. They really work as intended. We haven't quite, developed our design guidelines. We're going to take some of the feedback that you've given today, develop that, and then, the community will have the ability to review it and provide additional selections when we have more to offer. But yeah, absolutely, we're going to look into those. And we've started rolling them out on some of our bike streets as well, our neighborhood bikeways. And so it's something that the city is more and more comfortable with. To be fully transparent, it's things that, you don't necessarily think about, where we have to work with the fire department to figure out if that's a fire route, whether they can be slowed down, stuff like that. So, it is context sensitive, but it's absolutely something we're looking into, and hopefully we can use in our design guidelines.
Related to that, Amanda asked, will the city be removing snow? She has noticed that bike lanes have little to no treatment when it comes to snow removal.
We haven't figured out any sort of the maintenance plan, right? So we have to figure out, the program, where they're going to go, how do we maintain them? And of course, that would be part of the snow plan. I think it probably really depends on how much snow we get, and then where these are located. The city has snow routes that every time it snows, they'll plow. And then other streets, it has to be a certain amount of snow before they'll plow, maybe more of the local streets in front of your house that have less traffic, for example. And so it kind of depends. And then it also depends on, the amount of snow. But that would be our intention going into it, is that absolutely they would be plowed if there is significant snow on them.
We have a question from residents of East Colfax. They feel that some of the promises from Dottie are not coming to fruition in their neighborhood, and would like to know how this project builds equity into its programmatic structure and its guidelines.
Well, first, I apologize for, historically, maybe some of the projects or some of the promises didn't land in your neighborhood or others. I can't speak directly to those. But as someone who works at Dottie now, I can tell you very earnestly, we do take that very seriously and are continuing to level up our efforts on how we do that. Related to how equity fills in for this standpoint, it's at the core of what we're going to do. So it's going to be a major prioritization factor when we actually look at which streets should be implemented first on that list. And so it may very well come down to, a street which maybe doesn't have a 10 out of 10 for all the factors, but it's more important to put it there for a variety of social and cultural examples. We may do that one first. And so it's very important. And I applaud you for bringing that up, and please continue to do so during this process.
Kayla asks, are there considerations around budget just to get the project off the ground instead of widespread focus on artistic and social elements of shared streets? How to distribute the elements and build as quickly as you can, using the budget as wisely as you can.
Mm-hmm. Wow, budget question. Getting into the details here. So, it's important, right? I think what we're showing you right now and what we'll continue to show you is, quote unquote, the Cadillac, what we could do. Because we want that, design for perfect, but that doesn't mean we'll ultimately stop or slow down to implement that. We just want to start from the best possible place to make sure we have everyone's feedback and then incorporate that at different levels to make sure that we do make the most impact and can construct and implement these as fast as possible. So we won't necessarily slow down, if we need more funding or more community outreach for, a bike pump station or something like that, but we want to have those conversations now. So if it's in the budget, we are providing the things that the community thinks is most valuable.
And Ellen asked a related question. What's the timeline for seeing the first permanent shared street in Denver?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So this process of developing the program is going to end spring of 2023. Without boring too many folks, we have a forward-looking budget process at the city. And so we'll submit our budget requests for the first few streets to be designed. We wouldn't get that money until 2024. So then we would start designing it that year if we did get the funding and then actually request construction funding. And so it's very variable. A grant could come in. There could be political funding that comes in if this is important enough in an area. But through the traditional processes, we're probably looking at the first one to be fully open to the public, maybe around 2025 or late 2024.
And related to budget and timeline, Nolan asks, will you be moving forward with any temporary methods while you get the funding for more permanent solutions?
Yeah, this is a question I love and one I've been trying to figure out. Like I said, for us to go through the traditional process, it may take up to 2024 or 2025 for us to develop something, potentially even later, if we go through recession, there's not funding available, things like that. But that doesn't mean we couldn't do something at a lower scale earlier. And so we are investigating that option. I think it was showed on one of the earlier slides where we're going to have kind of a full, great, perfect pavers, all that sort of option. We're going to have what we would call like a quick build option, which is a little bit more scaled back, still as safe as possible, but with not necessarily a full like paver, implementation and more of a retrofit. And then I think what we're going to be able to work on also is to continue the temporary ones in some fashion. A lot of that depends on the community and ultimately what we can accomplish here, but would love to have the ability to do something quicker than kind of just that full capital implementation plan.
Ellen asks, is this program considering alley activation as a shared street type?
So we haven't yet. I think it's really interesting. I know other cities have done that in the past. And I think it absolutely could make sense in kind of the commercial shared street aspect. The difficulty with alleys is, they're 10 to 12 feet wide. And so if a car would go down an alley, there really isn't a ton of space for other people to be in that area. And so I think it probably just depends on the alley. If there's a really wide alley and it kind of makes sense, sure. If it is too tight, or there's not enough commercial support in that area, maybe not. So I think it's important. We'll certainly look into it, Ellen.
Josh actually asks another design question. He's seen things that work really well in Europe, and in particular using one-way effectively for improving traffic calming and multimodal usage. Is that being considered as part of this program?
Yeah, that is interesting. We have had some recent conversations about turning maybe some shared streets into a one-way where it makes sense. It's difficult, with one-way conversion. Traditionally in America, we're undoing a lot of our one-ways and turning them into two-ways. We've done several of those in Denver over the last couple of years because they're generally safer. But in the context of a shared street and controlling the flow of vehicles, I do think it makes sense. And so certainly it is going to be in our kit of parts for us to actually look at, depending on the street and where we actually implement. So yes, it is.
Moving out to larger streets, Topher asks, to what extent are you constrained by state rules and regs on streets that are highways or state highways?
Oh man, we're just getting technical questions. I love this. So to answer your question, there are streets in Denver that are technically owned and kind of quasi-operated, maintained by the state. So CDOT, a lot of those are the big streets, like a Federal, a Colorado, things like that, where we wouldn't turn those into shared streets anyway. They're they have a lot of cars because they're really designed to move people, very similar to kind of an urban highway. And that's, I believe, why CDOT originally kind of has ownership over that. That said, if there is kind of that unicorn street where they, own them, but it makes sense for us to work to turn them into a shared street, we have those conversations with them and we work with them to do that. But I don't think there's going to be really any or very many of those conflicts, just because of the streets we're probably going to select.
So Ferris asks, if a shared street no longer works for an area, what does the undoing process looks like? Will there be a process to do that?
It's an interesting question. Traditionally, when we install something, we go probably a little bit slower than what people would like, because we're very deliberate to have a lot of conversations with the community and make sure it is designed and sustainable and actually fits the bill. And so when it goes in, it's not something that fails because we've taken the time to have those conversations. That said, if we implement a shared street, the entire community hates it, there's significant safety issues, something's going on, the city will react and make the changes as necessary. But I don't think we'll get into that encounter, just because we're going to go slow and have those conversations with the community to make sure we do it right the first time.
Rance asks a question that got a lot of support that's kind of tangential to shared streets, but some residential streets may not be correct as a shared street, but they're in need of speed and volume control because of pedestrian and bike traffic. Is this being considered as part of this program, or does that fall in a separate program that Dottie is undertaking?
So it wouldn't be part of the shared street program. Certainly there are a number of streets in Denver that need safety improvements. But a shared street is kind of a different conversation. That's a complete transformation of the street. And so if there are streets where you would like to see some improvements, bikeway, pedestrian, traffic calming, otherwise, I would encourage you to go to the respective teams about that. If it's just something where it's a safety issue and there needs to be speed reduction or something like that, you can go to Vision Zero. You can find contact details on the website. If it's something related to bike improvements or pedestrian improvements, likewise, you can find contact details for the bike and ped team on our website as well. So I encourage you to do that. And then also 311 and PocketGov, you're able to report any sort of problems or issues that you see, and those actually do make it to our emails. And so we do see and respond and fix things if needed.
Back to a design element question from Nathan. I think this refers to the temporary shared streets. Roundabouts are significantly safer than regular intersections, but I feel that keeping stop signs at these at the intersection with a roundabout was very confusing. What was the motivation for the decision at the time, and is that being carried forward in this program development?
Yeah, so this is kind of getting into details for design, but a roundabout is something that's very large. You may see them, off of 70 to go to Frisco or a variety of other places. They take a lot of real estate, and they're almost exclusively designed for cars. What you experienced and what you're probably going to see more in Denver, what we call a mini traffic circle. And so they pretty much look the same, other than the scope is very different. So a mini traffic circle is just kind of a retrofit, putting a circle in the middle of an intersection, sometimes removing all the stop signs, sometimes removing stop signs in just one or two directions as opposed to all four. And they're designed to be safer, to slow down cars, but then also so bikes can navigate into them, and then also so no one can just blow the stop sign, because you've got a big circle in the middle with some vertical deflection as well. And so, not to get too technical there, but if you saw one during the pandemic with stop signs, it's probably just because it was going to be temporary, and we weren't going to remove the stop signs and then put them back in when we went back out. And so any future iterations you see around Denver will either only have two or none at all.
Thanks, Jay. There's a little bit of a conversation going on in the Q&A box concerning fire truck and fire truck access. Can you talk a little bit about how DFD is part of this conversation?
Yeah, it sounds like an interesting conversation. I'll have to look at that after this. All of our emergency services are working closely with us. It's very important for the police department and the fire department to get to where they need to go to address a crisis in a reasonable amount of time. And so, they need to operate on the same streets that we do. And so that's where we have conversations with them to figure out which streets maybe need to stay, not as a shared street because the fire department needs to work and drive through there, and which ones are maybe less important for them to drive through at a quick rate, but still work for them to stop at if there is a fire or an emergency, so they can still access. So, it really just depends. It's a conversation, and it depends on the street, but they want to get to where they need to go as quickly as possible. And I think you'd probably agree with that if you're on the end of that call. But at the same time, we know that, there aren't emergencies on all of our streets every minute of the day. And so we want to make them safer for everyone as well. So it's just a conversation we have with them.
Thanks. We have a pretty technical audience tonight. Allison asked, does the Complete Streets guidelines already cover this? Why are we doing more studies?
So the Complete Streets Design Guidelines, very educated group here, I love it, came out about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. It does have an addendum for shared streets from a temporary standpoint. It does not really have anything related to what a permanent shared street would look like. And so the design guidelines that we create in this process will act as kind of an appendix to that, an addendum. And so it's just kind of building, that booklet. But you are astute to notice that many of the treatments we were talking about are present in Complete Streets. And so they can be used for a variety of things, but we'll be taking it a step further than just traffic calming, right? We really need to slow down cars and divert them more so than just what a complete street would be for a proper shared street. So it's an evolution of it.
This actually might be a question for Rachel. John asks, do we know the reasons why people don't like shared streets?
Yes,
If so,
actually
what
have
are
the survey questions, the results from the last survey pulled up. A lot of the reasons that people do not like shared streets are things that we are actively planning to address in this planning process. So just high level, some of the things that we heard are that there was inadequate input from people and businesses most impacted. So things like this, we're trying to get your input and address that. Some people said that they were not needed or were redundant, tongue twister there, that they might have negative impacts on city infrastructure, that they were unsafe, such as automobile speeds and the roundabout. So we're also trying to address making them safer through this. The rules were confusing, same thing, trying to address that. Temporary barriers were poorly placed and designed. So that's why we're having the design guidelines to make sure that's really intentional. They created increased traffic on adjacent streets and alleys. We have a goal of really low volumes on shared streets. And if we need to implement diversion, we will. And then shared streets can be difficult for some older persons and people with disabilities. And that's something that we are considering in the design guidelines as well.
Thanks, Rachel. Nicole asks, will there be rules and signage on how to cross shared streets? I'm assuming this is in a vehicle. I found it conflicting getting through my neighborhood on shared streets, but wanted to honor that it was focused on walkers and rollers.
Well, thank you for, being conscious of, folks that were on the street and maybe slowing you down a little bit to get to your house, appreciate that. Going forward, like I said, we need to continue to provide access to people's homes, and that's why there'll be shared streets instead of closed streets, at least where they're located near residential houses. And so there'll be important considerations for that. And then before we would construct anywhere, we would have a lot of conversations with the community to make sure, the majority of folks in that area actually do want it. And so it's not something that's just going to show up in front of your house one day and you have to live with it. So there'll be multiple opportunities to be for or against it. And then also work with us as far as what the design would look like before it would be actually permanently in front of your house.
So somewhat related to auto traffic trying to move through, Christopher asks, were accident rates considered as one of the factors when evaluating where to create the temporary shared streets, and is it being considered going forward? There were a couple of recent incidents of people in his neighborhood of East Colfax and of great concern in terms of pedestrian safety.
Well, first off, I'm sorry some folks were maybe hit or had close calls with vehicles in your neighborhood. As a city, we're committed to Vision Zero, and we want to make sure that we don't have any fatalities and eventually get to zero crashes in the city as well. But related to your question, I do think we are considering it to some degree. But that said, the places that work the best for a shared street are naturally going to be the areas that don't have a lot of cars to begin with, or there aren't excessive speeding, which cause crashes. And so while it is a factor, we wouldn't find a really dangerous intersection and turn it into a shared street. There's other methods that we use there related to Vision Zero to actually make the appropriate speed and safety changes. A shared street is kind of more of a niche application related to placemaking and getting people to move and experience a place and build community. It's not necessarily wholly for traffic calming, although it's very good at that. But it's not probably the best application for stopping people getting hit, at least right now.
This is another question for Rachel, I believe. Both Sarah and Megan have asked about the stakeholder working group. Do you have people from every RNO on the stakeholder working group? And are the people represented on the stakeholder working group residents, just plain residents, rather than having particular areas of expertise?
Great question. Yeah, we invited all the RNOs to participate in the stakeholder working group. Some of them did decline. So if you feel very strongly that you would like them to participate, I would let them know. they can definitely join the stakeholder working group at this point. As far as having residents on the stakeholder working group, we typically have people that represent neighborhoods to do that. And then we use these community outreach touch points to have resident input in the surveys as well. So it makes it a little easier to manage and have those conversations at different levels of detail, but we're happy to chat with you if you would like to specifically add input.
I'm going to ask 2 more questions from Lynn, and then I think we probably need to be aware of our time with just a few minutes left. We don't want to keep people too late into the evening. But Lynn asks, how will you address parking and ADA access, handicap parking spaces?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like I said, a shared street, it's still going to be available for vehicles, folks that should be on that street, whether they live on it, they're providing deliveries, things like that. If there is a need for parking on those streets, we will provide it, although certainly at a reduced rate. Some of the images, I know it was a while ago that you saw from other cities, you could still see there was dedicated parking for vehicles. And so we anticipate still having that included in our shared streets as well. But we'll have those conversations with the community. There may be, at places that we don't need parking. Currently, there's a block of a shared street off the 39th Avenue Greenway Trail, just outside of Cole. There's no parking on that street. It's adjacent to a trail. There's not any homes there. It didn't make sense. So it's really going to be context dependent. But yeah, there certainly will be some with parking available.
So questions that went unanswered, we will try and gather everything into an FAQ and post the answers on the website. It's been a terrific group of folks with a really sophisticated set of questions. So thank you for participating.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise. Really appreciate your time. And I will say, I did see one comment about how you can further participate. And so I'll say, obviously, stay in tune with our newsletter. Please continue to respond to our surveys, get your neighbors and friends and even people you don't like to respond to those. More feedback is always appreciated. And then if you want to go above and beyond, please feel free to reach out to your city council member or other elected officials that do impact projects and budgets if you do feel strongly about them. So those are certainly ways you can get involved and have your voice heard through the political process. All right, with that, I think we're a few minutes early, 1 minute, but I want to thank you all for taking the time. Please stay involved. You'll be getting an email tomorrow with, I think, the report out of questions and then also of the recording if you didn't get a chance to view it or not all of it, or you want to share it. So you'll have that opportunity, and please stay in touch. We look forward to continuing this process with you. Thank you.
Thank you.